All right, now we're going. Okay, anyway, okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on. Social psychology was born in this era when there was just a ton of stuff happening. Fascism, the Great Depression, the world upheaval, and of course World War II occurred from 1939 to 1945. And just after World War I, German psychologists Kurt Kafka, Max Wertheimer, and Wolfgang Köhler, who were all students of an individual by the name of Karl Stumpf. They came up with a concept of Gestalt. The idea is that you don't have to have all the information. All you have to do is have pieces of information, and you can make a whole out of all those pieces. So you've got these little chunks of information, and you just stick them together, and you've got a whole idea, and that's known as Gestalt. The reason I mentioned Karl Stumpf is because Karl Stumpf was the grandfather of a student of mine at Ashford, and she actually took my social psychology class. And when I started talking about Gestalt, she got all excited because her grandfather was kind of the father he was actually the professor of all the individuals that came up with the Gestalt idea. Gestalt emphasizes the mind actively organizes stimuli into meaningful wholes. We're always trying to fill in gaps. If we have a gap in knowledge, we try to fill it in. Different people fill it in different ways. If you watch Fox News, you fill it in one way. If you watch CNN or MSNBC, potentially you fill it in another way. This became quite controversial during the Obama administration because there was one news agency that attacked him mercilessly, and there were other agencies that supported him to a major extent. So there was a disagreement taking place. There was a disagreement taking place. So we fill in information. We don't have all the information about what's going on. We may look at news stories. We may read the front page of the newspaper, but we don't have all the information. So we have to fill it in however we can, and we do that with the information we get from either whatever news agency we happen to use. And we are doing this constantly. We are always filling in information. We don't have a choice. Otherwise, we have no information, and we're not going to wander around with no information. We need to understand things. Oh, I guess I better make sure I'm shooting in the right direction. I may be looking at the wall or something. Oh, I am. That's kind of exciting. Okay. Looking at the wall. Okay. So that's Gestalt. So Gestalt is part of social psychology, so just like it's part of any psychology, any psychological concept. We don't have all the information, so we have to fill in the gaps. The reality is that psychologists do this constantly. When I talk to somebody and they're telling me about what's going on, usually they leave something out. And of course, in order for me to understand what's going on with them, I have to fill in the gaps. And sometimes I fill in the gaps incorrectly, sometimes I fill in, hopefully I do it more often than not correctly, filling in the gaps with the information that I need. But a lot of people will hold things up. I had problems with my old man last night. He got drunk and went to bed mad. Did you leave anything out? Well, of course you did. He popped you a couple times. Oh, yeah, that. He took the dinner and he fed it to the dog. These are little pieces of information that we don't have, but I have to fill in the gaps because you're not really giving me all the information. And that's the way it works in counseling. You're trying to figure out what's going on. Freudian theory is that these individuals aren't giving you all the information. Sometimes they're not giving you hardly any information, and you have to figure out why they are having a problem. So Gestalt is very real. Gestalt is a constant in our environment. Gestalt. Oh, changing dynamic. Of course, societies will change. depending on what's going on, will change the dynamic. This is just a story. I don't know if you've seen the Navy SEAL that's transgender. He's a woman now. She's a woman now. And he teaches people how to shoot, which is kind of interesting. So there's this, this person that's all dolled up, teaching people, taking apart a weapon and putting it back together, teaching people how to shoot. Anyway, Carl was a Navy SEAL. After he got out of the Navy, he decided that he would confront his sexuality, and he decided to join a gay group in San Diego because he realized he was gay. Before Carl joined the group, they would just sit around in the bar and complain about how they were treated in the community. After Carl joined the group, members were more willing to admit their sexuality, and they became more socially active. The group dynamic changed because of Carl. Carl gave them more positive feelings about themselves. Not because, I don't know, because it just changed the dynamic of the group. And this happens constantly. If you, well, we just added a new psychologist to the group. I know. Does any of you guys have Sue in your class? How's she doing? Is she doing okay? You haven't had a class with her?
No,
you got
holiday on Monday.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, she's a lot more intense than either Sarah or I are. I guess we're going to look like sleeping beauties or something. We're going to look like we're sleeping compared to Sue. She's real dynamic. So we'll see what happens. And we'll see if it changes the way that that we teach psychology. I mean, it could very well do that. Sarah and I will change because Sue adds a new positive or negative. It could be negative as well. Concept to our psychological group here. We'll see what happens. Everything's exciting, isn't it? The constant change. After World War II, social psychology blossomed as research sought answers to problems of the day. Theodore Adorno and Stanley Milgram had influential research programs searching to explain Nazi atrocities. We couldn't understand. It was really difficult because once we broke into the death camps, we realized that the Nazis were trying to exterminate whole masses of people, primarily the Jewish people, but they were also exterminating anybody with any physical abnormalities, any mental abnormalities. They just killed them. They just gassed them. They tried to kill off all the gay people, which was kind of interesting, because the first group of Nazis, there was a relatively large percentage who were gay, and these individuals didn't survive. They took them out and shot them. They were killing evangelical Christians for a couple different reasons. Germany's kind of an interesting country. Interesting country. Southern part of the country is Catholic, and the northern part is Lutheran. So the German government, at this point, the German government supports, and at that point, they supported both churches, but that's all they supported. So a different idea, a Mormon going to Germany, would not be acceptable, because they've got a Protestant religion, that's Lutheranism, and they've got Catholicism, so they don't need an extra one. They don't need somebody else. If you go to Germany today, it's really hard to find anybody that's Jewish. Well, they killed them all off. And if you're Jewish, why would you want to move to Germany? I mean, these people have already tried to exterminate your race a long time ago. Anyway, so we couldn't figure out what was going on. The German people seemed like normal individuals. But normal individuals don't attempt genocide. A whole country attempted genocide. And people claim that they didn't know. They had no clue that the government was trying to exterminate the Jews, despite the fact they've got all these clouds of burning human flesh coming out of the crematoriums. What did they think was going on? The smells. The smells of burning human flesh are completely different than the smells of anything else. Anything else. Humans, I don't know, we have more fat, we have more sugar in our systems, I don't know. We smell different. We have a Swedish smell. Sweet, not Swedish, sweetish, with a T, not a D. We have a sweet smell about us. You guys don't need to know that. Anyway, okay, Nazi atrocities. So we're trying to figure out about what was going on with all these Nazi atrocities. But the Nazi atrocities weren't the only ones that were taking place. We had a very difficult time fighting the Japanese because the Japanese would not surrender. They would fight to the death, or they would commit suicide. That was the only way that so we were not able to capture them. And if we couldn't capture them, we couldn't question them and find out what was going on. So this was really difficult, fighting the Japanese and the Germans. The Germans were tried to kill all the Jewish people. They tried to kill all the people with any abnormalities. They tried to kill anybody with a different religious idea than they had. And the Japanese, they felt superior to everyone. When the Japanese went into China in 1937, they went into China and they just started killing everybody, bayoneting babies and chopping the heads off of people as sport. And they were killing tens of thousands of people just as a bloodlust. It was just insane, and it would go on for days. They went into Nanking and they eliminated almost the entire population, raping and murdering and doing all kinds of horrible things. And we couldn't understand this. We started fighting the Japanese on the islands, and we had to kill everybody. The first battle that we had with the Japanese was the Guadalcanal. There were like 100,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, and we captured 10. We were only able to capture 10. Well, what happened to the rest of them? One of the things we learned was the Japanese fight to the death, and they will kill us, so we have to fight to the death. We had no choice. So the first islands that we captured, we were getting no prisoners at all. We had nobody to interrogate. It's really kind of fascinating. Eventually, of course, things changed a little bit. When we told people that they had to capture people, they would go out and try, and that would be their mission, would be to capture a Japanese soldier. And we would, but they were still fighting to the death. This whole banzai attack thing, I don't know if you've never watched a war movie from World War II, you don't understand what they were doing. They were just all coming toward you. Sometimes they didn't even have bullets in their guns. They were just trying to overwhelm the defenders. And they would kill hundreds of them. Just kill everybody, kill all the Japanese. And if they didn't die, they would take a hand grenade and explode it and kill themselves. As confusing as that is. Anyway, okay, so different societies, different ideas. So here we are, we're taking on these fascist groups around the world, and of course now we need to understand what's going on. It was really kind of interesting after World War II. The Japanese surrendered, and we were afraid that we were going to have to annihilate the entire population. The reason we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima was we knew that everybody would die. We knew that we were going to kill tens of thousands of people. And then we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And we knew that we were eliminating that entire population. But the other choice was, if we have to invade Japan, they are going to fight us, the children are going to fight us with sharpened bamboo sticks. We knew all this was going to take place. And they were preparing for this to take place. They were giving people sharpened sticks to attack American soldiers. They were giving people hand grenades. They were giving them means to kill the American soldiers. And it wasn't just the adults or the old. It wasn't just the adults or the teenagers. It was the little children. They were all being prepared to kill us. However, after the emperor told the Japanese that they should surrender, and they did, they became extremely docile. You would think that after the god-awful war we fought with these individuals, where we couldn't capture anybody, where they would murder and torture the individuals that they captured, you would think that we would have a lot of trouble keeping them under control after we took Japan. But we didn't. We didn't have any trouble at all. All they needed to do was hear it from the emperor that they had surrendered and that they were supposed to get along with the American forces. And there were very few negative incidents that happened after the war, despite the fact that, my God, it was just the worst war, the most horrible conflict that you can possibly imagine. Very strange. So we were trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Why did the Germans not admit that what was happening with the Nazi regime, that they were trying to kill off all the Jews? Everybody knew that they hated the Jews. They had this propaganda going from 1932 until the end of the war. They knew that they hated the Jews, but they had no clue that they were trying to exterminate all the Jews. That was the idea, anyway. So they did experiments trying to figure out if people follow orders or if they don't. If you know something is wrong, do you do it anyway? If somebody tells you to do it, that's the question. That was the question that Milgram and Adorno answered, and we're going to talk about the Milgram experiment later. Leon Festinger developed a theory of cognitive dissonance, trying to explain how Germans could ignore the obvious, and that's where the concept of cognitive dissonance comes from. Cognitive dissonance is still an accepted theory today. The idea that you can have two different ideas, two conflicting ideas in your brain at the same time. Tobacco is bad for me, but I'm going to smoke anyway. Okay, it's right there. Cognitive dissonance. And we use it to explain a lot of different things. Marijuana makes me stupid, but I'm going to do it anyway. It relaxes me, so you're rationalizing at the same time. So cognitive dissonance actually came out of World War II. Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark studied effects of segregation on the self-concept of black children. Really kind of interesting during World War II. If you watch the movies coming out in 1939, 1940, 1941, it makes African Americans look as if they were equal partners in what was going on in the United States. Well, the reality is they certainly weren't equal partners. They couldn't get a fair shake down in the South, certainly, but they also weren't getting a fair shake up in the North as well. But we were here. The propaganda was telling everybody that we all have to get along. We all have to pull together to win the war, and that's exactly what was going on. After the war, of course, everything went back to the way it was before the war. So these two individuals were trying to figure out what was going on with segregation and how it made black children feel. And of course, what we discovered was that these individuals were feeling very badly about themselves because the society was telling them that they were inferior. And of course, that's where the civil rights movement came from. Ethical concerns spurred discussion and reform in the 1960s and 1970s. Protection of experimental participants from psychological distress became a concern following Milgram's obedience study and Zimbardo's Stanford prison study. Milgram did an experiment where he took an individual and he told them that they were shocking somebody on the other side of a wall. I'm sure we talk about the Milgram experiment all the time. It was a lie. They weren't doing anything, but they wanted to know if these people would be obedient. They were trying to discover why the Germans did what the Germans did. If you don't hate these people, why in the world are you trying to kill them? Why would somebody do this? And what we discovered was that about 2/3 of people, when they are told to do something, do what they're told, no matter what it is, no matter how horrible it seems the job that you're doing seems. You do it anyway because you are obedient. We are humans. We are obedient to other individuals. Zimbardo's Stanford prison study, he set up a prison in the basement of the psychology department, and he assigned some individuals as prison guards, and he assigned everybody else as prisoners. And they went out and they captured these people in the campus security cars. They jacked them all up. They took off all their clothes and gave them other clothes to wear. And then they put them in the prison. And what they wanted to discover was, would people accept the roles that they had, prison guard or prisoner? And what they discovered was that despite the fact that these were fairly wealthy, most of them were white kids, despite the fact that they had lived a fairly affluent lifestyle, as soon as they were put in prison, they accepted the role of prisoner. And they started acting like all the other prisoners around the world. Prison guards, on the other hand, despite the fact that they were really not prison guards and they had never been trained as prison guards, all of a sudden they took the role of a prison guard and they started becoming abusive to the prisoners, despite the fact that they had never been abusive before. Suddenly these individuals became abusive. So that's one of the things that we will talk about later, Zimbardo and Milgram. Milgram has died. He died back in the 60s, but Zimbardo did his experiment in the 70s. He's still alive and he's still writing textbooks, which is kind of interesting. This guy is still alive. He's kind of quite the character. Institutional review boards were developed to meet this need. One of the things that Milgram did, he wouldn't be able to do his experiment today, of course. It was too psychologically destructive to the individuals that he was working with. The same way with Zimbardo's experiment. If he had had to go through an institutional review board, they would not have allowed him to do it because there were some psychological problems with the individuals after the experiment. Really kind of a fascinating situation. The world very much dictates to the social psychologists what it is that they will study. In the 1940s, prejudice seemed to grip the world, and it was the main topic of interest to social psychologists. Prejudice, because, well, we had Germans that hated Jews. We had Americans that hated black people. We had Japanese that hated everybody who wasn't Japanese. So there was a lot of prejudice in the world, including in the United States, that we really couldn't go anywhere that prejudice wasn't rampant, relatively rampant. We had wealthy people that didn't like poor people. And that was in the 1940s, and it blew up into a world war. One of the things that you learn when you're in the military is that the guy standing beside you, no matter who he is or no matter how much you hate that guy, he's the guy that's got to protect you. And you've got to protect him. Because if you don't protect him, he won't protect you. So we had all these individuals jumping into foxholes together, and of course, one guy had to have the other guy's back, and it really didn't matter what race they were. It didn't matter whether they came from Italy or not. It didn't matter whether they were Greek or Slovakian. It didn't matter. But before World War II, in the United States, if you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you had a problem. There was a lot of prejudice, and the prejudice had to do with your religion, had to do with the color of your hair, had to do with a lot of different things. They could find lots of different reasons to hate you, as sad as that seems. And they did, but World War II changed all that. World War I changed all that. World War I, we had black troops in Europe, and actually they were in combat longer than any units, any white units in the war. The units were segregated, and they were segregated in World War II until we hit the Hurtgen Forest. That was right before the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans stopped us. And we were running out of troops. We didn't have anybody to fight. We were bringing people over from the States, but not enough. So they took some of the service troops, and some of them were black, and they gave them guns. And they said, you're infantrymen. And they fought very well. But all of the troops before Hurtgen Forest were segregated. And there were instances of white troops shooting black troops. and vice versa. Not so much vice versa, but there were incidences of white people, of white soldiers not tolerating black soldiers. A lot of prejudice. So in 1940 it was prejudice. In 1950 it was intolerance. You may think the two are the same, but this is when the civil rights movement started. Prejudice was rampant, of course, in the 1940s. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement started, and it was because they realized that their children were being destroyed. Their children had no self-esteem, so they wouldn't. They started going to court and trying to get things changed. Brown versus the Board of Education occurred in 1955. Well, it started in 1954. So intolerance was huge in the 1950s. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War started, and there was aggressive behavior all over the United States. Civil rights movement was still intact, of course. They were still fighting for equality in the 1960s, but they started fighting in the streets. Anti-war individuals were fighting in the streets. Our children were fighting their fathers and their grandfathers because their fathers and grandfathers were intolerant. So they felt like the only way that they could change the world was to go out and vandalize, go out and destroy something. And we had riots all over the United States. None of you guys remember any of this. We don't even talk about it. It's not in our history books about all the riots that were taking place in Newark, in Detroit, in Cincinnati, in Los Angeles, certainly, in Denver. They had race riots, and of course, that had to do with intolerance. We started getting groups that were violent. And one of the reasons why we just had Martin Luther King Day on Monday was because there were two voices not only in the peace movement, but also in the civil rights movement. There were two voices. One of the voices said, we need to do this peacefully, and that was Martin Luther King's voice. And there were other voices, loud voices, that were saying, we need to force the people in the United States to accept us. And that was the Black Panthers. There were a number of different groups that wanted to open warfare. They were looking for open warfare. And Martin Luther King, of course, was the voice of tolerance. He said, no, we can change things. I have a dream. We can change things. Blacks and whites walking together. And of course, that's the reason that we celebrate Martin Luther King. He was the voice of peace. If it hadn't been for Martin Luther King, if there had been no Martin Luther King, we may have split into civil war in the 1960s. And the question is, which side do you fight for?
His method is more peaceful as compared to Malcolm X too, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, he was one of the aggressive people. Yeah, he was the black Muslims. Yeah, it looked ugly. It looked like I thought we were going to dissolve into civil war. And as a white kid, I had to decide which side I would fight for. I mean, it was a very conscious thing. I needed to know which side that I backed.
But back then, you know, because everybody was against the blacks and the Indians, you know, the blacks and the Indians treated people really bad too, you know, like other races.
Sure.
As my mom said back then, she went to school in Denver, and the black girls would pick on her. And like stab her with safety pins and stuff.
Terrible.
Yeah, so I don't know. Well, that was the same era as American Indian movement too.
American Indian movement's a little bit later. They really didn't kick it up until the 70s.
Oh, the 70s. Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, they're a little not behind the times, but and the reality is nobody realized that American Indians existed. The only thing that we knew about American Indians were what we saw on television, and what we saw on television was cowboy movies. that were relatively negative. Well, not all of them. There was the Song of Cochise was Mike Lancero was Cochise. I know, it was great. Anyway, yeah, not a whole lot. There weren't any Indians that were acting, of course. They were all either individuals who were Hispanic or white people with brown makeup on. It's really kind of sad. John Ford did come to this area, though, and when he made movies, he hired the local indigenous people, and that they turned out to be Navajo, of course, because he was up in the Monument Valley. So all these people that were supposed to be, or all these Indians that were supposed to be Apache, were actually Navajo, which is kind of interesting.
Our breakfast at Tiffany's, that Chinese guy, he was white.
Breakfast. Oh, that's Pat Morita. Was it? Oh no, it was Mickey Rooney played the Japanese guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, with buck teeth and great big glasses. Yeah, and his eyes pulled back.
Yeah.
How insulting is that? Well, we see it as insulting now, but evidently everybody just laughed back then. So we weren't real happy with the Japanese. We were still pissed off with the Japanese. My dad died hating the Japanese.
My grandpa too. He said I can marry anybody, but I can't marry any Asians. He said you can marry a French fry, but you cannot marry any Asians.
They bombed Pearl Harbor. They snuck up on us and bombed Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the 1960s were the age of aggression. We were looking at aggression, trying to figure out how we could stop all these kids from running into the street and vandalizing and breaking windows and all that crazy stuff. 1970s, before the 1970s, women were housekeepers, and that's all they did. They were housewives. And they didn't, the educational structure supported female education, but about 70% of all the people in college were men in the 1960s. Only about 30% were women. Now it's 65-35. 65% of all the people in college are female and 35 are male. But this change didn't take place until the 1970s. Before the 1970s, Notre Dame was all male. All the academies were all male. All of the Ivy League schools were all male. Princeton, Yale, Harvard, except for Columbia. Columbia wasn't all male. So there was, the women didn't have a chance. Women couldn't get to a point of equality with men. And of course, the Christian religion tells you that males are always in charge. The Muslim religion tells you that males are always in charge and that females are always should be subordinate to the male. But then in the 1970s, of course, women got tired. They got tired of being second-class citizens. I can remember reading my sister's yearbook. She graduated in 1960. And they would always say what you wanted to do with your life. My brother said that he wanted to own the biggest farm in Indiana. He wanted to be a farmer and own the biggest farm in Indiana. But all the women would say, I want to get married and have children and be a really good housekeeper. That's what they said. I want to be a really good housewife. I'm sorry, not a housekeeper. So I know. So in 1960, all these women don't have any dreams at all. No dreams whatsoever. My sister said she wanted to change the world. And of course, for a woman to say that she wanted to change the world, women have no power. How in the world is my sister going to change the world? Well, the way she changed the world was she started an organization in Indiana called National Organization of Women. And they became a national group. So they had all these feminists that were they came out of the woodwork, and they did things like, they did odd things like burn their brassieres. And the reason they did that is because they felt like bras were making them try to look attractive to men. And they didn't want that. They wanted to do whatever they wanted to do. They wanted to start smoking cigarettes. They wanted to start drinking in bars, just like the men did. And of course, this was unacceptable behavior. Women weren't supposed to smoke. So the feminist movement in the 1970s. In the 1980s, we realized that the arms race was getting out of control. The United States had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 27 times, and the Russians had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 30 times. Well, how many times do you have to destroy the world? Wait, well, it only takes one to destroy the world. You don't have to do it 57 times. So we realized that, hey, you know, somebody could make a mistake. Some idiot could push the wrong button, like what happened over the weekend in Hawaii. You hit the wrong button, and all of a sudden, everybody thinks nuclear war is starting. Well, you know, if the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans had thought, oh, the Americans are on alert because of the alert in Hawaii, well, they could have fired their missiles. It could have happened. It could have been a mistake. And they started making movies to this end, this idea that we could have nuclear holocaust by mistake. So they tried to reduce the arms race, and actually we were able to do that in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we realized that people in the United States were too separated from one another, that we were all ghettoized, that all the white people lived over here and all the black people lived over there, and all the Italians lived over there, and all the Hispanics lived over here, that everybody had their own little place, and we needed to mix people together. We needed to support diversity, and that's what happened in the 1990s. And now I've got some pictures. This has to do with the civil rights movement. It started in the 1950s. If you've seen the movie, what is that movie? It's got it's the black ladies doing the mathematics for NASA. I can't remember.
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures. Yeah, my wife just loves that movie.
Me too.
She read the book. She bought the movie. You know, she watches it every time it's on television. And she's memorized the dialogue, you know, the whole thing. 1960s had to do with the peace movement, had to do with anti-Vietnam War movement. There were a lot of people that were rioting in the streets. I was in the streets as well. I was also in the streets for the civil rights movement. Where I went to school, I was in a dormitory with all the African Americans on campus because they couldn't join fraternities, and I was an independent. They had to be independent, so I became part of the civil rights movement in the late '60s, and also became part of the anti-war movement in the early 1970s, and then I of course joined the military in 1971, which doesn't seem to make any sense, but there is a logic to it. I'll explain it. Well, I can't explain it. It's kind of odd idea. Anyway, in the 1970s, of course, feminism became very popular. It was really kind of an interesting movement because it started out as equality for women. As I said, my sister was one of the founding members of NOW, the National Organization for Women. She has a plaque. My sister has since died, but she has a plaque in Indiana at the state capitol, stating that she was one of the founding members of NOW. So it's up there forever, I guess. It's in bronze anyway. My sister's name. Anyway, equality, arms race, 1980s, of course. This is when I was in the military. I was in the military from '71 to '80, 1983, and of course, one of the things we saw was there were a lot of people that marched against nuclear weapons. Really kind of tough being in the military in the 1980s in England or in Germany because there were people that were demonstrating against you just being there. The idea that you had nuclear weapons and potentially they could die because people would be targeting you. So it was really kind of a tough time to be overseas. The Japanese still will not allow an American nuclear ship to dock in Japan, despite the fact that they have nuclear power plants. But they will not allow an American ship that has any nuclear weapons to dock in Japan, which is makes it a little bit tough. Now, oddly, they can dock in Okinawa, which is part of Japan, but it's not part of the mainland of Japan. It's an island out in the Pacific. Anyway, so the 1980s were the arms race. 1990s diversity, we started seeing more diversity in television. These are the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, as you can see. There's one of each, which is kind of cool. Anyway, it taught kids that that everybody was okay, which is kind of nice. I mean, if you only see white people in positive roles, then you think that only white people are positive. But if you start seeing everybody in a positive role, and these become your heroes, then it's really hard to be prejudiced against Asians, or prejudice against African Americans, or prejudice against Hispanics. I don't know. I don't know what any of these guys are. Anyway. Diversity, 1990s. In the 2000s, of course, what social psychology is worried about is terrorism. 2001, of course, this took place on 9/11. The World Trade Center was destroyed by 3 airplanes crashing into the World Trade Center. So terrorism became extremely important. Well, who are the terrorists? Well, actually, the reality is that we've been dealing with terrorism forever. We seized the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and the Filipinos never stopped fighting against us, something that most people don't realize. So here we had a lot of our military in the Philippines fighting the Philippine guerrillas. Some of the guerrillas were Catholic guerrillas, some of the guerrillas were Muslim guerrillas, and they would do all kinds of interesting terrorist things. We could never catch them. We could never capture enough of them in order to make it stop. So terrorism has been going on forever. Well, not forever, for the entire 20th century, as far as Americans are concerned. When I was in the military in Germany, we were attacked by terrorists in Germany. They blew up USAFE headquarters, and I was stationed not in the headquarters, but on that base, and I was the first medic on the scene at the headquarters building. I was shot at in Wiesbaden by terrorists, which seemed kind of odd. We had a ball tournament. What was I doing in Wiesbaden? We were playing softball. We had a ball tournament that weekend. We started hearing, it's like popcorn, we started hearing people shooting. And a couple rounds hit the field. But the umpires decided that we wouldn't let the terrorists get us. By golly, we're just going to go ahead and play the tournament. Of course, we played the rest of the tournament looking over our shoulders. You know, you're in the outfield and you're kind of looking around to see if you can see anybody. It's really odd. I had a friend. Should I tell you this? Yeah. Okay. I had a friend that was having an affair with somebody else's wife, and she was at Wiesbaden. So I went to pick him up the morning of the ball tournament, and I got there at 7 o'clock. He'd been shacked out with this lady all night. So he comes out of the base housing and is headed to the car, and right in front of me, 2 cars in front of me, a bomb went off right in front of me. But it was 2 cars ahead. Okay. And it blew up, and it went that way instead of this way, and it smashed, 2 cars down. I was driving a Fiat Spider. It's a little sports car with a rag top. Okay. And this car jumped up, flew over the other car, and landed and crushed the car in front of it. If it had come backwards, it would have come right down on me. That was scary. Now here's the bizarre part. We couldn't do anything because we couldn't explain what that guy was doing there. So I got in my car and took off. Well, they thought I was the one that set the bomb. And of course, it's really hard to find a red Fiat Spider in Germany. They don't have red cars over there. Anyway, yeah, I got questioned by the police. And of course, we were ball players from Ramstein, so. Anyway, funny stuff. Okay. Our brains have a preconception of what we're looking at. And one of the ways that we can prove this is by looking at optical illusions. And of course, this is an optical illusion. Here we have monks dressed in white. And as they go into the horizon, they turn into water. So it's an optical illusion. We have preconceptions. When you first started looking at this, you may have seen these individuals, so you're trying to find people back here because that's what your brain wants. It's preconception. Your brain is trying to get you to make sense of this picture, and of course the picture makes no sense whatsoever. And here we have a guy that's shredding his guitar on top of a house. And we have the crowd up here, but then the crowd turns into houses. But our brains are trying to decide whether these things back here are houses or whether these are actually people. We're trying to make sense of it. It's an optical illusion, of course. Here's one. This is my favorite. How many horses are in that picture?
5. 1, 2, 3.
Is 5 the number? Is that the one you're going to go with? 5? Okay.
4, 5.
1, you have to count noses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. Okay. There's 5. Or legs, you can count legs. Actually, one leg's out, 1, 2. Anyway, horses. Kind of an interesting picture. This is a kid putting together a jigsaw puzzle. It looks like the puzzle is coming. Is this person real or is this person in the puzzle? That's a question you have to ask yourself. Optical illusion. So you're trying to make sense of what you're seeing. We have preconceptions. We know that this kid's real. He's not part of the jigsaw puzzle, but we have to decide whether she's real or not. Though most scientists would like to deny it, it is nearly impossible for them to put their cultural values aside and view another culture or their own with an open mind. And of course, this is known as, these are social representations, but this also has to do with value judgments. We all have value judgments. When people first started, when the Europeans first came to this area, well, I guess we have to talk about the Spanish. I keep thinking Europeans, thinking English, of course, or Americans, but the first Europeans that were here were the Spanish. And of course, they needed to make sense of what was going on. They didn't do this very well. Because they looked at the indigenous people and they decided that they needed to change you to be more like them. Their value judgment was that the only good person is a Christian person. So they tried to convert everybody to Christianity. They didn't just convert you. You either converted or died. It was really kind of an ugly situation. But they wanted to convert people. And of course, the easiest thing to do was for them to capture the pueblos, because these people would always be there. They weren't going to move. They weren't going to leave. It was really hard for them to deal with the Apache. It was really difficult for them to deal with the Navajo because you guys kind of moved all over the place. And if they came to Saley, of course, you went to Round Rock, and if they went to Round Rock, you went up to Kayenta. You know, you just went where you got away from it. But if you were a Pueblo, if you lived in a Pueblo, that was where you lived. You didn't, and you had always been there. So that's what they did. They captured Santa Fe, they captured Taos, they captured all some of the Hopi Pueblos in this area, and that's what they did. They controlled the Pueblos, but they weren't able to control the more nomadic people. And of course, you guys were one of those groups. Yeah, okay. So, and one of the reasons that they gave you the name Navajo, as far as they were concerned, it meant, as far as the people of the Pueblos, it meant one thing, but as far as the Spanish were concerned, it meant thief. I guess that's their definition, was thief. Okay, so it's really hard to look at a group of people and not use your own culture as a standard. So coming from Indiana, you know, there's nothing, the only thing that's green here are your trees, and your trees are evergreens. Of course, where I live, we've got lots of grass, really thick grass, really thick hay. That's, you know, and that's the type of farm that I'm used to. So when I moved up to Montana, we moved up onto the Buffalo Plains, and their farms are dryland farms. So if you're going to farm up there, you have to irrigate. It's the only way you can grow anything is by irrigating. But in Indiana, we never irrigate. Why would we irrigate when sometimes our fields are flooded? Why in the world would we even think about that? So as somebody from Indiana who is around a lot of rain, I never even thought about dryland farming. But when I got out of the service, I almost got out of the service at 8 years. I went up to Idaho looking for a farm. I was thinking of becoming a farmer up in Idaho. But it was dryland farming, and I had no idea what dryland farming was all about. I was, you know, in Indiana, you buy a tractor, you buy seed, you buy a plow, you buy a disc, and that's all you need. But in Idaho, you also have to buy irrigation equipment. Really crazy. Value judgment. The way I saw it. Two movements that have forced social scientists to acknowledge their social representations have been feminism and Marxism. You can see feminism as a horrible, horrible thing, or Marxism, that's the basis of communism. You may see it as this horrible, horrible thing, but what it actually did, it forced everybody to think about their social structure. Feminism forced people to question themselves. It forced people to look at the life that they were leading to determine if they were actually giving women an equal shot at things. It forced everybody to do that. It created a dialogue. It forced the dialogue. Marxism did the same thing. Marxism came out of, we've got 3 minutes. Marxism came out of the social revolutions of the 1840s. There were social revolutions all over Europe. They were revolting against the aristocracy, because before that, the aristocracy controlled everything. They owned everything. You were born into who you would become. You had no social mobility. So Marxism came out of that. And Marxism questioned the economic and the social structure of political entities. And that's what it questioned. And it continues to do that today. Marxism forces the question of, do we really, should we really pay deference to the rich? If you've ever been around somebody that's wealthy, and of course we're all around somebody that's wealthy right now because our president is wealthy, he seems to say some really interesting things, some really strange things. Where does he come up with these ideas? Well, he's never been poor. He doesn't understand. He understands his form of economics. He's created this his cabinet of very wealthy people. So the lady that's in charge of education, Betsy DeVos, her and her husband run these charter schools, and they make money hand over fist. And they do this by charging the individual a lot of money and paying the teachers a little bit of money. And what they want is to get money from the federal government. They're billionaires. I know. But she's not the only one, of course. He has billionaires all through his cabinet. Well, if you've got $1 billion, how do you understand somebody who only makes $50,000 a year? If that's all the money that I have, this guy has always lived high on the hog. He's always been, people have always given him stuff because he's wealthy. And that's the way it works with wealthy people. Do people give you stuff just because you're who you are?
Yeah.
They don't. If you were wealthy, you could do anything that you want. That's the way it works. Because we defer to them. Wealth is important as far as Americans are concerned. I know, and Marxism questions that. They say we should all be the same, that there should be no wealthy people. It's really kind of fascinating. Anyway, it forces people to ask that question. Now, whether Donald Trump has ever asked that question is questionable, but it forces everybody else to ask that question, but not Donald Trump. Anyway, we'll see what happens. This is really kind of fascinating, because we've never had anybody with this kind of money and this mindset. Because he says and does some really strange things, but nobody has ever questioned him. Everybody has always done what he said what he has said.
Even though he has all that money, it still doesn't. We still can't deny the fact that he's a complete, absolute, total idiot.